Hi, welcome to Key Questions with Key Staffers. My name is Jim Atterholt. I'm the Vice Mayor for the town of Fort Myers Beach. This is a program where we find subject matter experts for the town of Fort Myers Beach, particularly as it relates to Hurricane Ian relief efforts. And we have a great guest today. And what we try to do is we certainly will post this on all the town's social media platforms. But we've been very fortunate to have our friends in the media. Beach Talk Radio has been playing this show before their regular scheduled programming on Friday and Saturday. We ask our friends at the Observer and the News Press and the local TV stations, whenever they're working on a story that's similar content to one of our shows, to link to the story. And we ask our friends at home, particularly those folks who use Facebook, because Facebook has gotten out so much great information post-Hurricane Ian. If you see some content that you think would be helpful to your friends and neighbors, please link to it on your Facebook page and help us to get the word out. Abraham Lincoln said, "Let the people know the facts and the country will be saved." And this is our small effort to try to do that to benefit the people of Fort Myers Beach. Again, our guest this morning, or this afternoon, is Jason Green. Jason Green is a consultant for the town, and he wears a lot of different hats. But he's a land planner, but he's also a subject matter expert on flood and the National Flood Insurance Program and a litany of other things. And we want to talk today about flood insurance, the new flood maps that will be for Fort Myers Beach and will impact everybody on the island. And then we want to talk at the end a little bit about the comprehensive plan, just in broad terms, what we're trying to accomplish as we try to think about what Fort Myers Beach looks like island-wide post-Hurricane Ian. So Jason, we've heard a lot of discussion about the floodplain maps coming out. Before we get to the floodplain maps, let's talk a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program, what it is and what its purpose is, and the fact that the town of Fort Myers Beach has chosen to be part of this program and what those benefits are as a result of that.
Sure. The National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP acronym for that, is a part of a national program that was started by the federal government probably over 55 years ago now at this point. And part of it was to encourage people to get flood insurance. And so right now by federal law, you can't get a federally backed mortgage for a home without getting also flood insurance.
So any private bank that's FDIC would be included in that group, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So basically that's a way to encourage those two and protect that asset and protect that investment. So that's where the town's participation is because, one, it's minimum standards that are set under federal law. Then locally, you're supposed to adopt ordinances and the maps, as we talked about, that get kind of mapped out by FEMA and FEMA partners.
When you say minimum standards are set by the National Flood Insurance Program to be able to participate as a community.
Right. There's federal Code of Federal Registry. There's federal laws related to minimum standards. And then you have to abide by those minimum standards. And then there's a lot of choices local governments can make as far as those minimum standards or higher standards that you can adopt.
Is every community in America part of the National Flood Insurance Program?
There's probably a few that are not, that don't participate. They're very unique in probably the makeup of their community, but for the most part, most communities are participating, yes.
So Fort Myers, the town of Fort Myers Beach participates in this program. And as a result of that, what sort of benefits does the town get? I mean, obviously, people then, if they have a mortgage, have to buy flood insurance, but a lot of people without a mortgage choose to purchase flood insurance as well, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's always encouraged by FEMA and the federal government to, part of that encouragement is please get in flood insurance. Even people that are not in a area of critical or high flood risk, they encourage you to get flood insurance because there are times that those areas flood also. But here we're in a special flood hazard area.
I was going to say, stupid question given post-Hurricane Ian, but the whole island is a flood risk, obviously, for Fort Myers Beach. Right?
Yes, that's called a special flood hazard area. So okay. we have a couple flood zones, but it is a high-risk area because we're a barrier island.
Okay, and so as a result of that, but anyone, the federal government has to insure anybody who applies, correct?
Yeah, so essentially there's the program that is you can go through your insurance agent, and then it's actually backed and supported by the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's basically a pot of money that gets pulled together from all the policies, and then as disasters happen, that money gets doled out to repairs and replacement, that sort of thing.
And as they try to as they try to evaluate what rate to charge for your premium for your flood insurance, is that, I know we're going to get into the community rating system in a minute, but is that primarily determined on where you are on the floodplain map?
Yeah, so there's a couple different factors. typically I go into that. The previous way that they've done it is basically elevation of that structure, the home, as an example.
Now, elevation, is the home elevated or where you are in terms of on the floodplain map?
Where you are in relation to basically sea level.
Okay.
And then that ties in also to what is mapped. And so is it what kind of elevation is mapped as the risk in that area that you are in. And everywhere is a little bit different depending on where you're at. So whether it's north or south of the island, east to west on the island, those flood zones may change just moving over one lot.
So if you're in a dangerous area in terms of the floodplain map, but you've built your house elevated high, that potentially could offset.
Correct.
And your premium would then come down a little bit as a result of that?
Yeah, so essentially, yes, they call it freeboard, and that's the amount of elevation above the minimum, right? But there's also a penalty if you're further below that minimum height. So you might be what's called a -1, -2, -3. That would be essentially mean you're 1, 2, or 3 feet below that base flood elevation, and that changes your rate also. It used to. Now they've gone to a different model with this what's called I believe it's Risk Map 2.0. There's a new version of the way they do the math, which is a lot of people are still unsure of how the math comes out, but there's a program that basically put in all these details and it spits out a number for your policy.
But nobody has ever denied coverage. They just potentially would just have a higher premium based upon their risk, right?
Correct. And I think I believe in certain circumstances, there's some private insurance providers outside of the NFIP program that you could look at.
Sort of providers of last resort?
So, yeah, something like
Okay.
that.
So folks, anybody who has a mortgage on Fort Myers Beach, for the most part, has to have flood insurance.
Correct. That's
And
for
so-
the most part, yes.
And and as you're looking for what what kind of premium you're going to pay, your agent is going to look at what they call the floodplain map, correct?
Correct. Well, that's a start. We always have what's called elevation certificates,
Mhm.
and those help determine.
It was on my list to ask you
Okay.
what an elevation certificate
There's
was.
a technical form that's supplied by the federal government, FEMA, and it gets updated every few years in how they collect that information. But mostly the goal of that is to establish what is the elevation of the living level? You know, what is the elevation? Do you have flood vents that help reduce loss? Do you have all these other components of your house that can?
But unlike the floodplain map, which is of the whole island, the elevation certificate is for your particular structure, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yep.
So somebody comes out and does an analysis and gives you this certificate then?
Yeah, usually a surveyor can provide that, or engineer, depending on the area or the state and what they feel comfortable with. And basically, they shoot the elevations of different things like adjacent grade, what lowest structure, so maybe your stairs. We have a lot of properties on the island that are split flood zones. So your house may be in a V zone, and your deck or your pool may be in an A zone.
Okay, we're gonna get way ahead of us. So my elevation certificate, do I need that in order to get flood insurance from the National Flood Insurance Program?
No, my understanding is you don't need that, but it can help determine if you are a lower risk. So they may have you rated at one level, and you may be able to get an elevation certificate to show you're actually elevated higher than what they think you're at.
So an elevation certificate is something that I would get as a homeowner or a business owner to potentially help me lower my premium because I think my risk is lower?
Yes, we had an example a couple of years ago where a woman came in and was looking for some assistance. I believe she got a premium of $10,000 on a duplex.
Mm-hmm.
And walking through some things with her insurance provider, she basically ended up putting in flood vents in the lower part of her enclosed structure, which was storage. And those flood events alone changed her premium down to about $3,000.
But the flood events are certified or codified through this elevation certificate process.
Right.
So some analyst comes out, does a survey, and then documents that, and then you can then submit that to the National Flood Insurance Program, and then hopefully you'll try to get a lower premium.
Right. There's a place on the elevation certificate for all this type of stuff. So if you don't have flood vents, as an example, and you talk to your agent about what other things can I do to reduce my costs, that may be one of them. Add flood vents. That the required amount of flood vents. So in this case, this woman added the flood vents, had the person come out to do the new elevation certificate. There's a spot on that form for those, describing where they are, how many square feet they're serving, that sort of thing. And then she turned it into her agent, and they re-rated her policy.
Does every structure on Fort Myers Beach have an elevation certificate?
Probably not. All new structures do. Anything that's been constructed under this program and policy has to have at least one. We usually do plans or a to-be-built kind of elevation certificate or part of your plans, and then you usually shoot your elevations during construction, and then you'll have a final. And we keep the finals as part of our program.
So if I have an older home the only time I would try to get a new elevation certificate is if I thought my premiums were just unusually high.
Yeah, perhaps you notice that they had you rated at a -3 and they think you're 3 feet below flood. And so if you got an elevation certificate to show that you're 1 foot below or 1 foot above, that could change your premiums.
And your agent usually kind of advises you.
Yeah, they can, yes, talk to your agent. Your agents usually are it's write your own, is what the federal government calls it. So they use the local agents as the kind of go-between. And it's usually, most of them have pretty good knowledge.
Given your experience in Southwest Florida, what's the number one thing somebody could do to lower their flood insurance premium?
For existing, I guess I would call it maybe non-conforming structures, things like flood vents that are in your storage.
What's a flood vent?
Well, it's basically a hole in the side at the bottom within 1 foot of grade. And usually what they are is they have a lever or a panel that can flip open. And that's intended so when the pressure of the water comes, instead of taking out the wall, it'll open that panel and allow that pressure to stabilize inside and outside of the structure. And that's you can only use those in storage and parking areas. So if you have an enclosed area below, that's when you would add those.
So instead of a breakaway wall, the vent opens up so the wall doesn't have to break away.
Correct. That's the idea. I mean, right. Yeah. V zones, you have breakaway walls and flood vents. And our A zones, you're required to put in just flood vents.
Okay, we're going to get to those zones. Any suggestions for our viewers to lower their flood insurance premiums?
Elevate.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah, simplest answer is if you can elevate your structure, do the math on what the changes are. You can probably reach out to your insurance agent or any insurance agent and ask them to run, what if I elevated 2 feet and I was a foot above or 2 feet above, what have you. And they can probably run that through and give you a scenario of what that dollar amount would be. And then you can kind of make a decision. And I think people see over 5 to 10 year period, you'll recover those costs.
Well, and we're going to transition to the maps here, but this is a good, I think, transitional point because when you said raise 2 or 3 feet, as people decide to rebuild, or if they have to rebuild because they're beyond the 50% rule, they're going to have to go above 2 feet. They're going to have to go up significantly, right? Depending on where they are on the floodplain map.
Yeah, so we have a lot of older structures actually on the beach that are pretty close to the base flood elevation. Or we found one the other day. It was a 1967 structure that was actually above the current base flood elevation. So they're actually fine as far as that 50% rule. But yeah, there's a lot of structures that are what they call pre-firm, prior to the flood insurance rate maps. And so rebuilding, they have
What year was that? Do you know?
1984 was the first maps here. There's been other maps, but updates, but the 1984 basically we use that as the cutoff date for the first map. Anything built today has to meet today's standards.
So just, I think this is an important point. So anything post 1984 had to be elevated if you were going to build it on this island.
Yes. Yeah, the maps and the elevation numbers might be a little bit different from then till now. But yes, it would have.
Aside from the nuances of the elevation might be just a little bit different. So anything pre-94, that's really where the 50% rule comes into play. Because post-94 would have been theoretically built according to code.
Yes. So the nuances of that are every time you have a new map, everything that was already built is now pre-firm, right? So, and I can use my own house as an example. My elevation went up 1 foot. I was compliant with the previous map. A new map got adopted. Now I'm not compliant. So you may have had a home that was built in the 90s that was compliant, and now is not compliant because of the change in the elevation.
And in your situation, you wouldn't have to necessarily elevate, but you could be penalized in terms of your flood insurance premium,
right?
Because you're no longer
right. So the federal government changed the way they do the math again several years ago, and so the goal is that everybody that's at a higher risk, that's below those elevations, there's an increase annually to that policy amount. The goal is to get that number up to, I believe they call it the actuarial rate. Basically, you want to get it up to what your risk is. So again, it's greater if you're further below that number, that magic number.
So let's go back up 10,000 feet again to, a lot of people are wondering if I elevate my house, if either I choose to elevate my house or I have to elevate my house because of the 50% rule, how high do I have to go? And a lot of that will depend on the new floodplain maps, because apparently those are revised probably every decade by FEMA.
Approximately. The current ones are part of the coastal remapping process that FEMA has been going through for, I think 6 or 7 years now.
And we have some new maps that have come to the town in November, roughly, at least the first drafts.
They became effective in November.
became effective, so they're final.
Yeah, so we've had versions of these maps hanging around and showing to the public for about 2 years now. So when we talk to developers or home builder, an individual that wants to build a home, we've always referenced those to try to as best as we can to show the difference in what they're currently at versus what the proposed is. Because we wanted to encourage people to build to a higher standard before even the maps got adopted. We don't want them to become non-compliant right after their home is built. You know what I mean?
So if those maps are final,
Yes.
what is it that the LPA and the town council will be doing as they review these maps?
So the council has, or I'm sorry, the LPA has reviewed a draft version of the update to the flood ordinance. So you have to adopt and update flood ordinances locally, which could be your higher standards or basically adopting the minimum standards.
Is the ordinance related to the new maps, or is it something separate?
Yeah, it's both tied to Florida Building Code, which also has some flood regulations incorporated into it. Florida took the steps several years ago to incorporate those flood standards as part of their building code. So a lot of things that used to be just in the flood ordinance are now already in the building code, and we have to do no matter what. So the +1 of base flood elevation +1, which is, again, is called freeboard, that's codified in the Florida Building Code. That doesn't need to be in your local ordinance anymore. Really what we look at is higher standards. If you're going to reduce the amount of enclosures below flood, if you're going to allow more code enforcement options and activities, if you're going to require a higher elevation, some communities.
When you say we're looking at is in terms of revision of our ordinance?
Correct. So these are all things that you have a choice to, locally you have a choice to make.
The maps themselves that came out in November, we've got a little kind of a rough map of our island.
Sure.
Let's talk about how our island sits just in general, and let's talk about how the maps have changed over the most recent iteration. But as you look at our island in general, are there lower parts of the island, higher parts of the island in general? Can you make some sort of sweeping generalizations as we look at our island?
Sure. So the entire island is either a V or an A zone, and the V stands for velocity. So that's an area that they map along the coast, essentially, that is identified by the FEMA and their mapping partners. They model it through hurricanes. Basically what they do is they go back and look at all the hurricanes, all the storms, try to get a history of elevations. They plug it into some supercomputer somewhere, and then they run these scenarios, and they come up with these elevations of storm surge and wave action, all that. So the velocity zone is where they expect waves, and that's where you see a lot of that damage. And I think we saw that here, things along the beach, especially older structures, they got torn apart and destroyed and deposited somewhere
First
else.
floors of condominiums wiped out. Yeah.
Correct. So that was mostly that's the force of the waves and the power of the water.
So the V zone would be on this edge here.
Yeah. So most of it would be run parallel to the coast.
Okay.
The changes to that question is the old maps. I don't recall any V zones on the back side of the island, but because of the way the mapping is, and I remember them saying several years ago when I was working with another community asking these questions, what's the difference in the modeling? And they said it's more accurate on the backside of islands and backside and inland. So what we've done is actually not just on the V zone on the front side, but on the on the bay side, we've got a couple more V's than we used to.
So there are some V zones on the
Yes.
bay side?
Yeah. So if you think about it the way a hurricane spins, and it spins counterclockwise, and so that push of that water onto our shore was really what caused that damage, right? And that was spinning from west to south to east.
Okay.
Same thing can happen once the storm passes your island. You've got kind of a north to west to south spin that could push water back onto the island. So that's why on the eastern side of the island, there's a couple V zones that got picked up.
So down in the southern end of the island?
I believe it's mostly on the southern end where you have more open water. So my understanding of the models and the computer models is the more open water you have, the more time it has for water to pick up and become more impactful.
So if you're in a V zone, obviously your flood insurance premiums will be higher, right?
So it has a different construction standard. So
Okay.
by the building code and by the NFIP programs, there's different construction standards, such as you generally don't have separate side garages. You're very limited, breakaway walls and flood vents. You can't do backfill in a concrete pad on top of fill because there's an expectation that the wave action will kind of tear away at some of that.
And this gets back, Jason, for anybody who's now, if this was a pre-84 structure, you would have been fine.
Right.
But if that was damaged beyond the 50% rule or just literally destroyed, as you consider building back, you now have to build back at these V zone restrictions or guidelines, correct?
Correct. And so the main difference in the V zone, like I said, we've added a few on the east side, the bay side of the island, but the V zone line actually moved closer to the Gulf, which was a surprising shift. Where it used to be, for the most part, be on the away from the Gulf on this across the Estero. Now it's kind of moved back towards the middle of the Estero a little bit. And again, that's generally speaking, it's different everywhere from north to south on the
When you
island.
say it shifted from where to where, pointing on the map?
So along this entire corridor,
Uh-huh.
in most places where it was on the east side of Estero, it is pulled back towards the center of Estero a little bit. In some places, even towards the western side of Estero. Where in most, generally speaking, most places it was all the way on the east side and into kind of the side streets a little bit for the V zone. So the location of that V zone has changed a little bit, but that's where we've had this new zone, which is called a coastal A. Not to make things more confusing, it's still an A zone, but it's recognizing on the maps that there's an area where there may be some wave action.
So it's in between a V and an A?
Yeah, it's kind of between an A. We treat it as an A unless, again, your local ordinances have the ability to adopt higher standards and treat it a little bit differently. Right now, the proposal is not to treat those differently.
So most of the property along the Gulf here is a V zone,
Correct.
and most of the stuff in the bay side in the center, with some exceptions,
Once you cross the Estero, for the
Uh-huh.
most part, with some exceptions, it becomes an A zone.
an A zone. And what's the difference between living in an A zone? What are the restrictions? Just less, you have more options, or what?
Different construction techniques. So it doesn't happen a lot here just because the soils and the way the island is, but backfill, when I mentioned that. So stem wall, basically block, like at my house, I have a concrete block stem wall, and then it's backfilled, and then you put the slab on top of that. That kind of construction is allowed in the A zone, whereas you don't allow that in the V zone because those waves can damage that support.
People ask me all the time, how high do I have to go? And does it just depend if you're in a V or an A, or are there different areas within the A?
There's different areas within the A's and the V's, and it all depends from west to east. So what we saw was a little bit of a reduction in the elevations required closer to the V areas and an increase in some of the A areas. But they stayed in A, they didn't go to a V. So you're going to go higher, but you can still go
If
to the
you're
V.
in an A zone,
Mhm.
all of the building guidelines are the same, except the only thing that would differ is the elevation of how high you'd have to go, depending where you are on the island. Is that fair?
That's fair,
And
yes.
so if you're in the V zone, everything's the same in terms of the restrictions, but it will depend on where you live in the V zone in terms of how high you have to go.
Yes, and what's unique and a little bit challenging for people to understand and unique to Florida is that state law requires us also to follow by DEP, Department of Environmental Protection. The Florida DEP has a study for a coastal construction line that is established along the coast in certain communities. We have a lot of it. Almost our entire coast is within that. I think the entire western side of the island is within this DEP controlled area. They have different elevations that are even on these new flood maps. So that study and that determination of those elevations supersede by state law, even when we put on the flood
And
maps in the V zone.
In this coastal construction line in the V zone, that's what's potentially impacting what can be built back at Times Square.
Well, both of them are. Just the V zone itself,
Uh-huh.
and then further to that is the elevations that
So,
something would have.
so it's the combination of those two that are impacting.
Right.
Is it impacting other areas of the island that would want to rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the council for years has talked about the impact of height. And so as the higher you have to raise a home, the more height it gets, and potentially the more impact it has on other properties and other structures next to it that are not elevated. So, and then that kind of bleeds into your setbacks conversation that you've had over the last few years.
But I thought the elevation piece, if you're in the V zone or the A zone, the elevation piece was set by the National Flood Insurance Program, is it? Or is it actually set by our own ordinance in terms of how high you have to go?
You're supposed, what they say is you got to use the best data available.
Uh-huh.
And for the most part, the flood insurance study and the flood insurance rate maps are the best data available as far as construction. In Florida, again, that coastal construction area, DEP by state law has oversight of that essentially, and they have a different study that has a different elevation. And sometimes it's a foot, sometimes it's 5 feet. It really depends on where along the coast that is. But everywhere else, it's really determined where they don't have jurisdiction over, that becomes the map.
So for the average person who's got either a business or a home on the island, how do they find out where they are on the new floodplain map? And then how do they figure out how high they have to build, or their builder has to build to be compliant with the new National Flood Insurance Program guidelines? How do you figure that out?
So there's a digital map that is a FEMA hosted map, and I believe it's listed on our linked. There's a link to it on our building department website.
So that's in
And
the
if there
permit,
isn't, we'll make sure it's on there.
it's in the permit section?
I believe it's in the permit section,
Okay.
but if not, we'll make sure. I know it's on community development. It's in there. So basically it's a link that goes to their maps. You can put in your address, and it takes you to your parcel by address, and it should be able to show you the lines. And so that's an example of, you can look to see if you have 1 or 2 or 3 flood zones mapped for your property.
Okay, it shows me my lines, and I'm in an A zone.
Right.
So do I automatically, but I don't have to figure out where I am in the A zone to figure out how high I have to build?
No, every zone is numbered, right? So that's where it comes in. You're not just in an A zone, you'd be in an AE 11 or 12 or 13. And that number is the feet above sea level. And then Florida Building Code requires you to add 1 foot to that. So if you're in an AE 13, then you know you've got to build your minimum height of your finished floor where you're going to live is got to be 14 above sea level.
So you figure out you're in the A13,
Right.
and then you've got to go 13 feet high plus an additional foot,
Under Florida Building Code, yes.
and that's the Florida.
That's not local, that's statewide.
And that would be your actual, where your floor itself would be, or under the lower the foundation of the floor.
In the A zone, the finished concrete slab of the living space has to be just at or above that elevation.
So it's the slab in your living room would
Correct.
have to be above that elevation. So it have to be above 14 feet.
Right. Now, there's a whole bunch of nuances about what a floor is, and if you have stairs that have a landing, that gets really complicated. I don't know if we go into that, but in general, the living floor has to be above that elevation. Whereas what I think you referenced in the V zone, they measure to what's called the lowest structural member, and that's basically the beam. That's kind of the main support beam structurally for the house. That's where they measure the elevation. So there's about an 18-inch difference in where you measure.
So if you were a V13, you'd have to be 14. Your structural beam has to be 14 feet high.
Yeah, the bottom of that beam would be at about 14 elevation, which would put your finished floor probably around 15 and a half or so.
Okay, it's that first horizontal beam that goes. It supports the floor.
Right.
That's got to be 14 feet.
Right. Again, they're accounting for wave action. They don't want a structural component that's holding the structure up to have waves banging against it. So they're trying to account for the lowest part of that structural member, and then that's where the base flood elevation is measured. Again, the DEP number along the coast supersedes that in certain areas. But
Can you make any generalizations in terms of is the north end of the island lower than the south end? Is the south end higher? Is the middle? Where's obviously the Mountain House is an area that's, I think, one of the highest parts of the island, which is
Right.
mid-island.
Right.
Can you make any sweeping generalizations just for people who are interested in how the island is shaped or
so? Yes and no. The base flood elevations are not really relative to natural grade. So the highest point of the island would still have could have the same base flood elevation requirement. Say, let's call it 80-12 or something like that. Adjacent neighbors might be lower, they would still have a 12, but they're protected more because they're elevated on land, right? Because it's all in reference to sea level. I would say on the south end of the island, I think there were some V's that popped up down towards the bridge. Some neighborhoods that were used to be an A that are now a V zone. So any new construction would have to meet that standard. But from west to east, there's a little bit of an increase in the middle of the island of what the base flood elevation was, but it stayed an A.
So for anybody who's watching, if you did not exceed the 50% rule, you're fine with all this. You continue to be you continue to be grandfathered.
Correct. That's a common term used. Is if you're not meet the 50% threshold of repairs in pre-storm compared to pre-storm condition, then you're allowed under the policies to rebuild or repair essentially.
And as an expert on this, as you advise builder owner permits or contractors who are looking to get a sense of how high they have to build the V and the A zone, any advice you would give them? I think we just kind of went over it, but is there any common mistakes that you see people making as they try to assess the height that they need?
I think one of the mistakes is not utilizing the extra freeboard. So generally speaking, or at least it used to, the policies, you got a bigger discount if you went 2 or 3 feet above that minimum base flood elevation.
What's a freeboard?
So the freeboard is the extra space. So if your base flood elevation is 12, Freeboard is that 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet above that. So if you went to 13 from a 12, that's 1 foot of freeboard is what they call it, the extra protection. The policies, the rating of, or I'm sorry, the cost of the policies used to give a really big discount up to 3. There's not much of a return, I don't believe, above the 3 feet of freeboard. So if you were at 11 and you built to 14, you're almost maximizing those discounts that you could get based on construction standards. And we don't measure height of your structure until you've utilized all that. So if you use 1, 2, 3 feet of freeboard, we're not going to penalize you on height. You still get your height allowed per the zoning regulations.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't eat into what you're allowed by right on the height.
I don't want to digress, but I was just, when we talked on the first time you were on the show about this program for people who do choose to elevate, whether they have to elevate, some people are choosing to elevate. There is a program that actually helps offset some of those costs if people choose to elevate. Could you just talk a little bit about that again? Because I think people were interested in that.
Yeah, so basically, if you have flood insurance, there's a program, I believe it's a rider to the policy, that basically you can qualify for up to $30,000. And I don't know if that's based on the value of the home or a percentage, but there's potentially money that they're supposed to allow you to help rebuild higher. And I believe it only kicks in if you're substantially damaged.
Okay.
I've heard some rumors of people fighting or arguing or discussing with their insurance companies about getting it if they're not substantially damaged to try to prevent that future damage.
And you use the term substantially damaged. That generally means somebody you'll have to tear it down, or it's
Right.
been
So
destroyed.
right. So the thought on that that additional compliance, it's basically money to help you come in compliance of a higher standard.
Okay.
So the thought is if you had a pre-firm structure, you elevate it to a certain amount. Today you have a higher standard. There's more cost to elevating, so that $30,000 or whatever that number ends up being is supposed to help you come into that increased compliance.
And you said people have been asking the town for letters to confirm that they're substantially damaged.
One of the things that our understanding is one of the things the insurance companies require is a letter from the town confirming substantial damage.
And that $30,000 would be in addition to the claim that is paid by the flood insurance program.
Correct.
It would be that claim, your normal claim check for whatever they assess your damages. I think the cap's at what, 250,000 for an individual home, and then you could get an additional 30,000 if you decided to build up. Is that correct?
Well, one, you have to build up so if you're substantially damaged, so it triggers offsetting some of those costs.
Yep.
And that's called ICC, increased cost of compliance. And so that's what that.
So if people who are building up and have had substantial damage or were substantially damaged, they should ask their agent about that program.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say ask your agent if you're not substantially damaged and you want to elevate. I don't know that you'll get it, but go ahead and ask and see if there's a way to talk them into, especially if they had damage. Why would we want to repeat that damage? So there may be an opportunity to kind of.
And one of the things we talked about too, and I know times are tough economically, but we talked a little bit about there's that program which advantages people who build up. But you'd had some pretty dramatic. You've seen some pretty dramatic numbers with respect to reduction in premium insurance premium costs for people who choose to build up.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about that? I know people don't see that right away, but in a long-term dynamic, that could be pretty substantial in terms of your savings if you choose to build up, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, the example I gave earlier was, I believe it was somewhere around $10,000, and just putting in flood vents dropped it to about $3,000. It's a $7,000 per year change.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of $15,000, $17,000 premiums for structures that are below flood. And a lot of that's dependent on change of ownership, which can reset that grandfathered rate. Or if you lost coverage and then try to add it, that can jump up your
So does it work similar to like the homestead tax credit? In other words, if you move or sell, you lose your grandfather status in terms of your premium?
I believe they've kind of changed it in the last few years, but essentially if you're in your home and you have a policy, it will probably increase if you're pre-firm. If you're not compliant, it'll probably increase over time. I think it's 10 to 12%, something like that, every year.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to get that rate up to, again, that higher rate that matches the risk. But you are kind of grandfathered in a little bit with those rates. Now, if you drop it and lose it, or somebody new comes along to buy it, they're going to be given a rate that's new. That is probably the higher rate. But to your point, saving $10,000, $15,000 a year on insurance makes that $30,000 investment recover pretty quick. So it's a lot of money, but at the same time, within a few years, really, I encourage anybody to talk to their agent and see if they can get if I elevate, if I don't, what does my policy cost, and then make a decision on that return on an investment. I think a lot of people see if you can make a $10,000 cut in your policy cost,
That adds up.
that adds up really quick, and you're safer.
You've got an extensive flood insurance background, as well as being a professional planner. Any other questions you get on the flood maps or on the flood insurance program? One of the things that people get frustrated with is what's called the community rating system. The town, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the town participates in the community rating system because if we take certain steps to do the elevation and take other precautions, the National Flood Insurance Program looks at our community collectively and gives us discounts collectively for flood insurance premiums. You want to talk a little bit about the community rating system?
Sure.
And how that's important and how that saved the town, both residents and businesses, money on their flood insurance premiums?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's a 10 through 1 rating. 10 being the kind of lowest, just entry level participation, and there's very minimal discount. I think it's just by the Florida Building Code, we essentially get to a 9 or a 10. But the town has chosen to participate in that CRS program and do certain things, adopt certain regulations and policies, do activities throughout the year to try to reduce that number closer to 1. So right now we're a 5. We used to be a 7. Right now we're a 5, and that 5 brings a 25% discount.
25%.
Right.
That's pretty big. So
Per policy.
I think it was just a couple of years ago that we moved from a 7 to a 5, correct?
Right. So we did some additional things and probably got lucky with some of the points, frankly, but we were able to scratch out a 5. And so for the period of time between what I call audits, essentially is between, they come around for us, it's every 3 years, it used to be every 5 years, but they recheck kind of what you're doing. And all they're doing is they want to make sure you're implementing your own policies, you're doing a good job, you're keeping records, there's all these standards, that you're protecting and preserving structures. That's the main part.
So that 25% discount is applied to everybody that has flood insurance on the island of Fort Myers Beach. Is that right?
Yeah, so the new way they're doing the policies is not as obvious on that discount. They promise us that it's embedded in the formula that when you get your amount. But yeah, it used to be right on your policy. It would say the dollar amount minus 25% because of the local community, and then give you a new number. I think they've made it a little bit harder to find now, but yes, so supposedly they're giving that discount based on the rating.
I know as a council person, I hear people complain about some of the onerous things that the town does, and they find it onerous. Can you give an example of a couple of the things that the town has done to move from a 7 to a 5 that has resulted in substantial savings for the flood insurance piece?
Sure. I think what's important, I mean, we should give credit to Lee County, and they kind of have been a centerpiece to all the communities in Lee County, and basically the public participation part of it, and the outreach to the public to notify them, build higher, build safer, wet season's coming, clear out drains and ditches and that sort of thing, things that can help very simple affect or reduce flooding. They've been a great part of that, partner to that, and they kind of lead that charge every year for all the other communities together. So we're all participating together and trying to have the same message. So whether you're in Fort Myers Beach or you're in Lee County, we're trying to tell the same story. But yeah, there's things like that we do that take staff time and take an investment from the community, with the hopes, obviously, that the return on that is a couple $1 million a year in savings, for hopefully peanuts compared to that dollar amount right. But it's always it's a return on investment, right? So we try really hard to make sure that we're getting the word out, educating people. We send out flyers, we send out mailers, we do all kinds of things to reach out to people to let them know.
What other kind of questions do you think our permitting folks are getting as it relates to the flood maps and the whole elevation piece and the flood insurance piece? Anything else you want to kind of elaborate on before we shift gears?
Yeah, it's probably equipment. A lot of people didn't have substantial damage, but they lost mechanical equipment. So AC, pool equipment, all those types of things. And so what the program encourages the community to do is get people to try to elevate the air conditioner equipment, as an example, as high as possible. A lot of these structures, we know you can't go very high because it may be low to the ground. Putting it on the roof, putting it on a platform, elevating as best as possible, so that you can get, basically it's all to be able to get into the home quicker. You want to return after a storm, don't want to come back to mold. So the more your AC equipment, as an example, is protected, the more likely when the power comes on, you're going to be able to dry the house out. And plus, that's a very expensive item to replace. Yeah. So I always tell people it's the biggest part of it is we're trying to have these regulations and policies to help you get back into the home quicker after it is done.
One of the things that, as we change gears just briefly, I just want to do an overview on this because it's still in its, even though we've been talking about it for a long time, it's still somewhat of in its infancy in terms of the public vetting the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plans were new to me as somebody who came from Indiana. We don't have comprehensive plans, and every community is required in the state of Florida to have a comprehensive plan. And ours, it has to be revised according to state statutes, I understand it, every 10 years. And we're in the process of revising ours, and we were doing that before Hurricane Ian hit. And now, as I see it, we're really using the comp plan to sort of to encompass the vision of what we want our island to look like post Hurricane Ian. So it started off as a pretty, I don't want to say mundane, but very technical, just a lot of updating of various statutes and codes and ordinances to be in compliance with the state and the comprehensive plan requirements. But now it's becoming sort of a vision piece as we decide what our community wants to look like. Just talk a little bit about, you've done a number of comprehensive plans, and we have an outside entity that's helping us with this particular comp plan. Talk a little bit about the experience and what the public ought to be thinking about as we explore this comp plan in terms of the various choices they might have.
Right. So kind of the comprehensive plan is this umbrella that's kind of the guide, the guardrail, so to speak, of development, whether it's from general uses like commercial, residential, industrial. Sometimes you can throw in some mixed use there. And really your land development codes or regulations are supposed to implement those policies. So you'll set things like floor area ratio, which is how big the box can be, how much square footage of a building you can put in a property. Then the uses of those individual, the square footage of the individual uses within a building, or the density, the intensity within that box gets set really more by the land development code. What does it look like?
And back what you said initially, where do you want your residential? Where do you want your commercial? Where do you want industrial? We don't have a lot of industrial.
Well, marinas,
marinas,
industrial like.
Yeah, and then and do you want, sometimes we want those to intermix, sometimes we don't.
Right.
And where do we want these?
Some communities like to have an office category. Some communities like to have a mixed use category that has both commercial, retail type stuff, residential, all different, there's all different versions of it. And we have a map that kind of really protected the residential part of it and then identified some corridors along the Estero for commercial. But to your point it's much different after an event like we had with Ian. You're talking about before Ian, you're talking about trying to picture it, right? Trying to envision what it would look like. And I think you have a benefit, the council will have a benefit now where you have people coming with ideas and you get to kind of test those ideas against your comp plan. A lot of people adopt comp plans and then don't really understand what it's going to look like. Then development happens and they may be very happy with it, may be disappointed in what they got. Here, I think you're going to have a good chance of seeing what people's ideas are, test it against your comp plan, say, do we really want this? Is that really what we want? Maybe we lower this threshold here. Maybe we increase this other threshold. You almost have these multiple test cases that you can kind of vet against the comp plan policies.
And I don't want to oversimplify this, but pre-Ian, the direction of the comp plan seemed to be the entity that's helping us with this was trying to create these various nodes of commercial activity up and down the whole 7 Mile Island, so people could have a coffee shop or a place to gather, and they can walk to it or bike to it from their homes. So they don't have to get in their car, and we would have these sort of nodes of activity, generally close to Estero Boulevard, up and down the island. Is that was sort of initially pre-Ian, sort of the vision? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so. It's really, we're at the point now where we want to fine tune where those boundaries, where they go. But to your point, it's trying to set up nodes along, up and down 7 miles to say, traffic's bad. Everybody complains about the traffic impacts. You can't really reduce traffic, but you can shorten the trips. And that's what the goal was, so that somebody doesn't have to drive all the way across the island or halfway across the island to be able to get some of those services that they need. Can we provide them more localized and maybe at a smaller scale, maybe mix in some residential with it, but for the most part, try to provide those services in a walkable, bikeable kind of format.
Jason,
the market has to dictate ultimately, but if we could set up these nodes, as you said, for success.
And I like the concept. One of the things I'm obsessed with is I can't stand it when people say there's nothing we can do about our traffic congestion. Right. We have to be thinking about traffic congestion, and as various entities along, particularly the commercial district, they want additional density, they want to do things, they want variances, they want special exceptions, and but it's unique here down in Florida. Generally, they've got to provide some kind of a public benefit in return for that ask. And one of the things I've been challenging various potential developers is I'd love to see pedestrian overpasses over Estero Boulevard to allow the traffic to keep moving, even if it's going 5 miles an hour. As long as it's moving, people are generally okay. It's when it comes to a stop for an hour for no reason, and it drives people insane, and rightfully so. And I think it affects the quality of life. So I had mentioned at Times Square, potentially if they want to do something different or need some help from the town, pedestrian overpass, a second pedestrian overpass over to Margaritaville. I've talked about one in front of the Lani Kai. I've talked about one in front of the Red Coconut. And there's some potential density down here on the bay side near Moss Marine, where I challenged them. I said, you're going to have all this additional density. What about running a ferry, a water ferry, start at this end of the island? They could pick people up here at the Fishtail Marina, hit the marina behind Publix, go down to Moss Marine, maybe go over to San Carlos Island, and just keep running this ferry, water ferry, so people on the south end where a lot of the population is, they can just, or even the mid-island, they can walk to the marina, get on the boat, go down to the north end, have dinner, do some shopping, watch the sunset, and then come back on the boat and not clog up Estero Boulevard, or at least reduce the congestion. And that to me, that would be a public benefit that they could trade for doing something unique or different, or asking for additional density. Is that the kind of debate we're going to be having in the future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that sounds like what the council's somewhat direction what has been to date. And we've talked about prioritizing, our presentations as staff to the council, about prioritizing what it is you want to get out of the plan. And so I always encourage communities to set the bar where you want it, right? Set a high, low, whatever you want, but set the bar.
What do you mean by setting the bar?
What is it that you expect every development minimum to do, right? So I think one of the examples, there's several communities around the state that give bonus density points. The developer can earn this extra density, but a lot of times it's for things that they have to do anyway, like connect to water and sewer. Right? So you don't really give bonus density for something they have to do to have the project anyway. So there's little things like that, or whether you could do higher stormwater treatment, higher quality water quality treatment. One thing that we've talked about is in certain parts of the community, we just don't have enough right of way to be able to provide all the infrastructure that you talked about, whether it's bike, ped, maybe more lanes, whatever. There's not enough room in the right of way for that. That's some communities identify that as something that could lead to additional density. That's all part of that public realm that you're talking about, whether it's bridges or water taxis or contributing and participating in infrastructure improvements.
Yeah, my vision is a water ferry that can take 50, 60, 70 people, not just one person.
Sure.
So it can really have an impact on Estero, or at least some impact. And again, I'm hearing from a lot of the smaller and mid-level hotels that in order to rebuild with today's prices and insurance costs, et cetera, they're going to need some additional density. So the question is, what do you ask for in terms of a public benefit in return for that density? And those are the kind of issues that we're going to be wrestling with.
Yeah, I mean, I always encourage communities to think about it in scale to what's being asked for too, right? So the mom and pop going from 10 little motel units to 20 motel units, is that a big jump? Probably not in the over grand scheme of things. So can they fund a water ferry or some other major improvements? Probably not. So there's got to be some relationship. We call it rational nexus, some kind of relationship to what they're asking for. But at the same time, each part of the community might be have a little bit different needs. And I'll use that right away example. North end, very narrow right away. South end, wider right away, more comfortable. We got a pathway and the roadway and all that. So those are two little things that we could look at and think about. Connectivity is a big deal. There's just not a lot of connectivity.
It's so hard
than Estero Boulevard.
It's so hard to ride your bike along here. It's a challenge.
And going north to south is Estero. There's a couple neighborhoods in the side that have some connections, but there's not a lot of connectivity going north south other than Estero.
But this is the time to think about these big picture issues, because we've got a really I would call it a renaissance on steroids here as we go post-Ian here, and there's a lot of opportunities for creativity. How does the public best provide input into this process? Obviously, the LPA is considering it now. Those are public events. I'm guessing at some point, as it goes from the LPA to the council, there might be a public, maybe a town meeting where everyone could come and see the plan, see some ideas. Everybody provides the public input. We certainly want to make sure the public feels like they're part of this process.
Right.
What have you seen other communities do to be successful? So making sure the public feels like they've got a stake in what's happening.
It's tough because there's different stakeholders that have different concerns and different issues, right? Some people that live here don't want more development. People that have lost their business want to be able to provide and rebuild. I want to tie it back into the flood maps, where you will have a choice ultimately. How do you treat land use and this comprehensive plan and future land use map? How do you treat that related to the V zones and the A zones? Because that'll drive, some of those uses will drive kind of how redevelopment occurs. Certain things can't be done in the V zone. Or do you want to reduce residential development in the V zone to get people that are going to be living here maybe year round or even seasonal out of harm's way and maybe trust commercial buildings can be built stronger than a house could, so to speak. And so those are decisions that you guys are going to have to make also. I think what they could do is participate. That's the easiest. We're going to try to have some town hall type style meetings. We've talked about reaching out to the commercial developer or commercial landowners and try to explain to them, here's what the comp plan is showing as a draft. Where do you think you fit into this? How do you fit into this? But at the same time, we want the residents and people that visit the island to participate if possible too. So we don't have all that worked out, but the goal is to have some forums where we can communicate with those people.
Well, I don't think the timing could be better because this is to do a comp plan, which is really the vision that will undergird the land development codes, will undergird the comp plan.
Right.
But to develop that vision for the island at this time, it's although tragic, it is a really an opportune moment because we already have all the tools in place to put that vision forward.
Right. And we started this. And the process before this wasn't necessarily storm related, but it was age, housing stock, age of the commercial buildings. They were all, a lot of them were getting to the age of, you can't just keep repairing them anymore. So what happens when those go away? Well, we had it wasn't just age, it was an event that kind of drove that. So the conversation really is the same that we started before, a little bit tweaked to it and maybe a quicker response, hopefully. But we're lucky in some regards. A lot of communities start having this conversation after an event and try to re-envision. And I think we've already been taking those steps to have those conversations. So we're ahead of the game a little bit, so to speak.
Well, I appreciate having this conversation, Jason. I appreciate you being with us. If you particularly have somebody who's wrestling with the floodplain issue, their flood insurance issue, please take the time to forward this video interview with them. Jason is available. You can reach him through the town website. He's an expert on these flood issues. But hopefully there was some information here that you could share with your friends and neighbors that was helpful. We touched again on the broader comp plan. There's going to be a lot more discussion on the comp plan going forward. But again, if you find this interesting and you want to share it and link to it on Facebook, that would be wonderful. But we're so thankful that you could be with us today, and we appreciate everybody conveying this information and passing it along to as many people as possible. We want to be as transparent about all this as we can, because again, the more information we can get out, I think that the better off the community of Fort Myers Beach will be. So again, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. God bless.
Is falling. So the water is subsiding. It's going back into its riverbanks, but it will take some time before we're out of that flood level. For that